The Roman Empire is often remembered for its discipline, its strategy, its unmatched military power. Men like Marcus Aurelius are praised as philosopher kings, rulers who spoke of virtue, duty, and justice while commanding the largest empire the world had ever seen. But that is only half the story. Because what Rome did after victory was far darker than anything that happened on the battlefield. History books talk about the battles, the formations, the tactics, but they rarely talk about what came next. The aftermath, the moment when the fighting stopped, and something far more terrifying began. Because in Rome, defeat didn't just mean losing a war. It meant losing your identity, your rights, your humanity, and sometimes, your future entirely. Imagine the year 272 CE. Outside the ancient city of Antioch, dust still hangs in the air. The battle is over. The Roman legions have won. The army of the East has been crushed. At the center of that defeat stands a woman who once ruled an empire. Zenobia, a queen who had dared to challenge Rome itself. A ruler whose territory stretched across Egypt, Syria, and parts of Anatolia. She had built a kingdom strong enough to threaten Roman authority. But now, she is surrounded, captured, defeated. Her generals expect death. A soldier's death. Clean, quick, honorable. But that's not what Rome had planned. Because Rome didn't just defeat its enemies. It transformed them. To understand what happened next, you need to understand something about Roman law. A concept called ius gentium, the law of nations. It sounds civilized, almost fair. But in reality, it justified something brutal. Because under this system, once you were defeated, you were no longer a person. You became property. It didn't matter if you were a soldier, a noble, or even a queen. Defeat erased everything. Your crown meant nothing. Your bloodline meant nothing. Your past meant nothing. You now belonged to Rome. Roman citizens had protections. They couldn't be executed without trial. They couldn't be publicly beaten without scandal. But foreigners, captured enemies, they had no rights at all. Ancient laws like the 12 Tables made it clear. Prisoners of war could be sold, enslaved, or divided among soldiers. Like spoils. Like objects. And for women, the situation was even more dangerous. Because in Roman military culture, captured women were not just prisoners. They were part of the victory. Some elite captives were spared immediate suffering, held for ransom, or used for political leverage. But most, they faced something else. Degradation. A slow destruction of identity. Because Rome understood something powerful. Breaking a body was easy. Breaking a spirit, that lasted forever. And nowhere was this more visible than in the Roman triumph. The ultimate display of power. A parade through the heart of Rome. A celebration of conquest. But also, a warning. The procession would stretch for kilometers. Crowds packed the streets. Thousands of eyes watching, cheering, celebrating. First came musicians and performers. Then wagons filled with treasure, gold, silver, artifacts stolen from conquered lands. Exotic animals marched in chains. Symbols of distant worlds now under Roman control. And then came the prisoners, defeated kings, captured generals, and sometimes queens. They were forced to walk through the city, in full view of the people, still dressed in royal clothing, still wearing symbols of power, but now in chains. Because the contrast mattered. The message was clear. Look at them. Look at what they were, and what they have become. When Zenobia was brought to Rome, she was not executed immediately. Instead, she was displayed, adorned in jewels. Her wealth turned into spectacle. Her power turned into entertainment. But it was the chains that defined the moment. Not iron. Gold. Heavy golden chains so large that guards had to help support them. Her own wealth. used to bind her. Her empire, reduced to decoration. And yet, she walked with dignity, step by step, through a hostile crowd, through hours of humiliation. She did not break, and perhaps that is why she survived. Some accounts say she was spared, given a villa near Rome, allowed to live, even to marry into Roman society. But make no mistake, she was no longer a queen. She was a symbol, a living reminder that Rome could break anyone. Not every captive was so fortunate. 2 centuries earlier, in Britain, another queen faced Rome's brutality. Boudica. When her husband died, he tried to protect his kingdom, dividing it between Rome and his daughters, hoping compromise would preserve peace. But Rome didn't honor the agreement. They seized everything: land, wealth, power. And when Boudica protested, they made an example of her. According to the historian Tacitus, she was publicly beaten, not in secret, not quietly, but in front of her own people. A queen, struck like a criminal, and her daughters suffered even worse. Tacitus does not describe it in detail, but his silence speaks volumes. Because even in a brutal age, some things were too horrific to fully record. This wasn't random cruelty. It was deliberate. A message. A warning. This is what happens to those who resist Rome. But Rome miscalculated. Because instead of breaking her, they ignited something else. Rage. Boudica raised an army, burned Roman cities, destroyed entire settlements. For a moment, it seemed like Rome might lose Britain. But in the end, Rome prevailed. And when defeat became inevitable, Boudica chose her own fate. Rather than become a trophy in chains, she took her own life. Her daughters disappear from history. Their story, never told. For those who survived defeat, there was one final destination, a place hidden beneath the celebration. The Mamertine prison. While the crowds cheered above, prisoners were taken below, into darkness, into silence, into a place where Rome's enemies were erased. Inside, there were no crowds, no witnesses, no glory, only stone walls, and the slow end of everything. One of the most famous prisoners was Vercingetorix, a leader who had united Gaul against Rome, captured by Julius Caesar, held for years, displayed in a triumph, and then executed in the darkness below. Another was Jugurtha. After his defeat, he was thrown into the same prison, left without food, without water, 4 days, until he died, slowly, alone. This was Rome's true power. Not just victory, but what came after. The ability to turn defeat into spectacle, to turn enemies into symbols, to turn human beings into warnings. Because every triumph, every parade, every broken prisoner sent a message across the empire. No matter who you are, no matter how powerful you become, if Rome defeats you, everything you were can be taken away. And that is the part of history we rarely talk about. Not the battles, not the victories, but the aftermath, the silence after the war. The moment when power shows its true face. Because in Rome, death was not always the worst fate. Sometimes, living was. If you want more hidden truths like this, stories that history tried to bury, make sure you subscribe. Because the past still has secrets, and some of them were never meant to be found. The torches had burned low by the time the doors of the palace were sealed. Outside, the city continued as it always had, unaware of what was unfolding behind thick stone walls. Inside, silence took on a different meaning. Because in the private chambers of the Empress, silence was never peaceful. It was controlled. Every servant knew it. Every guard understood it. No one spoke unless spoken to. No one looked directly at her unless ordered. Away from advisors, away from records, away from witnesses. where power was not bound by law, only by her will. There were nights when selected individuals were summoned, not by name, but by order. A servant would arrive quietly, deliver a message, and by the time the sun rose, that person's life would never be the same again. Some were chosen for their loyalty, others for their appearance, and some simply because they were noticed, which was often the most dangerous thing of all. Those who entered her chambers rarely spoke of what happened inside, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. Fear has a way of silencing memory, of turning experience into something that cannot be shared. And in a palace filled with whispers, the quietest people were often the ones who had seen the most. There were rumors, of course. There are always rumors where power exists without limits. Stories passed between servants in hushed voices, fragments of conversations overheard through walls, accounts that never fully matched, but always pointed to the same truth: that what happened inside those rooms was not about affection. It was about control. Some spoke of elaborate rituals, not ceremonies of honor, but displays of dominance, where obedience was tested, where submission was expected, and where refusal was never an option. Others told stories of punishment disguised as favor, of individuals who believed they had been chosen for privilege, only to realize too late that they had become part of something far darker, something they could not escape. Because once you were brought into her world, you didn't simply return to normal life. You became part of her silence. There were cases where those who displeased her were removed quietly. No trial, no explanation. Their absence never acknowledged. Their names slowly erased from memory, as if they had never existed at all. But what made these acts so unsettling was not just what happened. It was how normal it became. Inside the palace, people adapted. They learned when to look away, when to stay silent, when to pretend they hadn't seen anything at all, because survival depended on it. And over time, the line between fear and acceptance began to blur. What once shocked the court became something no one questioned, not because they approved, but because questioning power came at a cost. Even those closest to her avoided speaking openly. Advisors kept their distance. Officials focused only on matters of state. Because everyone understood one thing: the further you stayed from her private life, the safer you were. But history has a way of preserving what people try to hide. Long after the palace fell silent, after the empire changed, after new rulers took her place, fragments of these stories remained, written in private accounts, hidden in letters, mentioned briefly in records that were never meant to be public. They don't always agree. They don't always tell the same version, but they all carry the same feeling: that behind the image of power, there existed something far more disturbing. A world where authority had no limits, where people became tools, and where silence was the only protection anyone had. And perhaps that is what makes these stories so difficult to understand today. Because they remind us of something uncomfortable: that when power is absolute, it doesn't just control nations. It controls people, their choices, their voices, their lives. And sometimes, what happens behind closed doors is far more revealing than what is shown to the world. If you want to uncover more hidden stories like this, stories history tried to forget, make sure you subscribe. Because some of the darkest truths were never meant to be told.